So I've been playing Dynasty going on 7 years now, and I can honestly say that I have never seen a phenomenon quite like Kyle Pitts. And it's weird, honestly, so much so that this is now the third video actually that I've done on this channel specifically about Kyle Pitts in just a little bit over a year. And my problem right now with him is his current startup value, and to some degree as well, his current trade value, because he's been a first-round startup asset this entire offseason and a top 5 asset since March, which is actually pretty groundbreaking value for a tight end in Dynasty. And since collecting Dynasty ADP back in 2014 all the way till now, only 2 other tight ends have ever reached first-round value, and that was Rob Gronkowski and Jimmy Graham. However, Gronk reached that value only after he obliterated fantasy football with 82 for over 1,112 back in 2014, and Graham did the same thing, who reached that peak after his 86 for 1,216 season back in 2013. Those are historic seasons for a tight end, and it warranted being first-round startup assets in Dynasty. Now, of course, Pitts also had a historic season in 2021 as well. It was so historic, in fact, that his stats translated to 10.4 fantasy points per game, which was 11th among tight ends last year. Wait, that doesn't sound... Oh, it is right. That's weird. You honestly weren't happy last year starting him every single week. After his explosive 2 weeks in week 5 and 7, he only had one game inside the top 8 tight ends the rest of the season. You were better off actually not starting Pitts at all than starting him every single week. That's how bad he hurt you. Gerald Everett and Tyler Higbee were better options for you to start every week than Kyle Pitts from week 8 on. But clearly the thinking around Pitts is that he is going to improve throughout his career. I mean, how could he not? He's still only 21 years old, turning 22 in October. He's entering his second season in the NFL. He's coming off being the 4th overall pick and, again, a record-setting rookie season. Like, how does he not improve? So let's just talk about that for a second. First, I want to define my expectations for Pitts to become a breakout league-winning tight end. Historically, league-winning tight ends are those who simultaneously finish as top 12 wide receivers if they were scored that way at that position. That's what Kelsey has done for the past however many years. That's what Andrews did last year, Waller a couple years ago, Kittle back in 2018 in his breakout season, Gronk, Graham, I mean, even Zach Ertz did it once. So in order to score like a fantasy wide receiver 1, you need to put up at least 15 fantasy points per game, or over 17 games, we're just going to call it 250 fantasy points as a nice, easy number. So with that, how can we get Pitts to 250? Well, at least the biggest part that at least he needs to improve on statistically is scoring touchdowns, because on over 100 targets last year, he only scored once. Had he scored once more, he would have been top 5. Had he scored 5 more times, he would have been top 3, but he still would have only been at 206 fantasy points. And the problem was that he only saw 7 10 zone targets last year, which isn't really a lot. It's the same number as Mecole Hardman, Van Jefferson, Tim Patrick, and actually both Bengals receivers, Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. Pitt scored his only touchdown on one of his 7 10 zone targets, and the average touchdown scored with 7 10 zone targets last year was 2.3 touchdowns. 2.3. So even if Pitts was above average in scoring touchdowns with that 10 zone volume, he's not getting to 250 fantasy points. He might not even have gotten to 200 fantasy points last year. The other problem with Pitts scoring touchdowns is how bad the Falcons are going to be offensively this year. I mean, last year they averaged 18 points per game, which really translates to 2 total touchdowns and then a field goal. Of their total touchdowns scored, 20 of them last year were passing, 11 were rushing, so that's cutting the pie down even more for Kyle Pitts, just to the passing touchdowns. And that was with Matt Ryan, who I consider still a competent NFL quarterback. So now you insert Marcus Mariota, who in 4 seasons as the starter for the Titans has 1 season with over 20 touchdowns, and he has 2 below 15. Mariota is not a good quarterback, like at all. I have no confidence that he can support fantasy options on this team to an elite or at least even a great level. And that's even assuming that he plays the entire season and isn't replaced at some point by Desmond Ridder, who again, I'm not even sure is all that much better, especially as a rookie quarterback. I also went back and looked at how other players have produced on teams with 4 wins or less. And did you know at the tight end position, 67% of the tight ends with at least 90 targets on bad teams finished with under 200 fantasy points. Only 2 tight ends ever in that situation have broken 250 fantasy points, and they both did it on 135 targets or more which is a significant increase from what Pitts had last year at just 110 targets. I looked at the wide receivers as well, and again, with 90 targets on bad teams, 70% of the receivers on this list failed to hit 200 fantasy points, and only 14 or 10% of that sample size hit 250 fantasy points, though really it was only like 13, because if you can exclude Percy Harvin in 2011, because he like Debo Samuel that year with rushing volume. So 13 receivers since 2000 have broken 250 fantasy points, and all but one did it on at least 140 targets. Again, a significant increase from what Pitts had last year with 110. So in order for Pitts to become a league-winning tight end for fantasy, he either needs a lot more touchdowns or a lot more targets, or honestly, probably both, neither of which seem very likely in 2022 with Marcus Mariota at quarterback. He'll still be fine for fantasy for sure because he's a tight end and he's being scored as a tight end. He just might not be all that different than, say, like TJ Hawkinson or Dalton Schultz or even Zach Ertz in the Cardinals offense this year. So then we fast forward to 2023, and the projection is that the Falcons are going to play their way into drafting Bryce Young or CJ Stroud as their new franchise quarterback. So then we run with that, and then the problem becomes that he is now catching passes from a rookie quarterback, and we know that rookie quarterbacks aren't good for fantasy receivers or pass catchers. Like, just think about it for a second. Was Trevor Lawrence any good for any of his receivers last year? Was Zach Wilson? Was Mac Jones? Was Justin Fields? Was Tua Tagovailoa? I mean, Larry Fitzgerald was the wide receiver 35 during Kyler Murray's rookie season. Joe Burrow supported Tyler Boyd, but that was strictly on volume with as many pass attempts as Joe Burrow had before he got injured in 2020. And then there's Justin Herbert, who's like the one exception. So unless the Falcons draft the next Justin Herbert, then they're not going to do well in 2023 with a rookie quarterback either, meaning Pitts is again going to be held back by how bad this Falcons offense is going to be. And you can tell me that talent always overcomes bad situations, but that does not happen. We know that that doesn't happen. Like, what has been happening to DJ Moore his entire career, or Terry McLaurin? Everybody was telling me how good Terry McLaurin is, just in a bad situation based on my last video. What are we doing right now to DK Metcalf, who was a top 5 Dynasty wide receiver, but now has Drew Lock, and we're dropping him to maybe being outside Dynasty wide receiver 1. So let's say we get through 2023 and Pitts is still a good, not great tight end, but what happens to his value at that point? Does his value go down because he hasn't lived up to expectations, or does it stay where it's at as we have hope for his situation and it improves with better quarterback play as he enters the prime of his career? Basically, what I'm saying is I don't think that his value increases over the next 2 years. Honestly, it could decrease over the next 2 years, and it's almost impossible to actually increase because of how high it is right now. Unfortunately, this is like the biggest conundrum with Kyle Pitts' value right now. A lot of the recent trades on the DLF Trade Finder are actually undervalues to acquire Pitts, meaning that his trade value is actually lower than his startup value, which is super weird to see for a top 5 Dynasty asset. And what that tells me is that a lot of managers who have Pitts either aren't selling for cheap and no one's willing to pay their price. So then the only trades that we do see happen are when those Pitts managers are willing to come off that price and sell at a discount. Like, that is super weird though, because that's not happening with other elite assets like Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, even Jonathan Taylor. When you trade for them, you're paying the price to get them. So in a startup, I don't really want to be taking Kyle Pitts at 1.05, 106 or whatever, because then the trade value after the fact isn't there unless he starts producing like an elite tight end, which we've already gone through saying that it might be probable that it doesn't happen over the next couple of years. But if you already have Kyle Pitts on your roster, let me give you a couple examples of what to sell Pitts for, what I'd be looking to sell Pitts for right now, including Pitts for DeAndre Swift and Travis Kelce, or whatever this trade is that was made by Russ Fisher actually, and we talked about on last week's trade show. Pitts for Jalen Hurts and a 23 first in a Superflex league, or Pitts and Zach Wilson for Kyler Murray, George Kittle, and Darnell Mooney. These overpaid deals are being done for Kyle Pitts. It just takes a certain manager who's willing to pay up for them. I would also love Pitts for like Mark Andrews plus or George Kittle plus, just tearing down to one of those guys to where you still have an elite tight end in value and possibly production as well, but then you gain a good asset on top. And if you're not getting offers like that for Pitts, then you might as well just hold because it's not worth it. But it's definitely well worth it to go out there and see what your league might be willing to pay for Kyle Pitts. But before you do head out and you make some offers, listen into this video as Russ and I talk about 3 players that we would love to buy right now in Dynasty.